Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Well, welcome back. It's our tradition before we start the talk to introduce ourselves and go around the room. Sometimes we have questions to personalize it a little bit. So today maybe we could all say something about spring weather. Talking about the weather is pretty traditional. My name is Peter, and spring brings me allergies.
My name is Andrea, and spring weather brings me warmth.
Jack, I like it.
I'm Brock, and spring brings me hope.
I'm Kay, and springtime means gardening.
My name is Michael, and spring makes me feel awake.
My name is Howard, and spring makes me feel new.
I'm CJ. No more winter jacket for the year.
I'm George Hubbard. Renewal. Spring is a time for renewal.
I'm Justin. Strawberries.
I'm Mark. Spring makes me feel warm and think about things growing and sneeze.
Richard, I didn't hear what it was, but buds on the tree.
I'm Peter Dell, and it brings out the sun worshiper in me.
I'm Marvin. Spring makes it easy to be happy.
I'm Todd, and spring means I can start growing vegetables in my garden.
I'm Joe, and spring means just warmth in the bones.
I'm Tom. I hope spring helps my arthritis calm down.
I'm Carl, and I appreciate all the seasons.
I'm Ray Dyer. I appreciate the light.
I'm Don Rupert. I love the sun. I welcome it. And it ends the sadness and blueness that accompanies SAD in the wintertime. So it's a wonderful time.
I'm Clint, and I like seeing all the green hills.
I'm Jim. I appreciate the colors of the spring wildflowers.
My name is Steve. I'm really a New Yorker, so I'm surprised it's happening.
My name is Jim. It reminds me how beautiful life can be.
I'm David Axel, and it brings memories of Wisconsin and thawing inside and out.
I'm Keith, and it's still raining in Seattle.
I'm David, new beauty.
My name is Mark, and spring puts a smile on my face.
I see. I'm Pam Weiss, and I took a long walk through Golden Gate Park yesterday and just loved soaking in everything blooming. Yeah.
Thank you. Did everyone speak?
Lenny. Light and lushness.
Well, welcome back. Now proceed on to our Dharma talk. Our guest today is Pamela Weiss, and she has practiced Buddhism for 20 years, including several years of Zen monastic training. the hard stuff. She is a meditation teacher, professional coach, and leader of coach training programs. She is currently in teacher training with Jack Cornfield at Spirit Rock. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you. Oh, it was just so lovely to hear a room-wide poem, The Thoughts on Spring.
Could you speak a little louder?
Yes, and if you can't hear me at some point, just raise your hand. I'll do my best. And interestingly, my talk today is about the power of words, the power of language. And at least for me, hearing everyone's introduction and reflection on the turn of season evokes something. You could just feel in the room. Maybe all of us were thinking internally about the change of season and the beauty, but to hear it, to have it articulated, changes something, evokes something further. So I've been teaching a Buddhist class that focuses on what's traditionally called right speech, or appropriate speech, or wise speech. And I'm going to say a little bit about, from a sort of more traditional perspective, about what I think of as the do-nots. So there is a fair amount of teaching in Buddhist and certainly other traditions as well about what to not do with one's speech in order essentially to not cause harm. But I also want to emphasize today, as we had a wonderful taste just a few moments ago, the power and potential of words, which is a piece that's not emphasized quite as much. So I'll start with a story that demonstrates this a bit. There's a story about a family who had a child who was sick, unwell, and they called into their home a Sufi master and healer with the hopes that he could help, I don't know about cure, but help heal and make their child well. So the Sufi master came to the home and he went to the child's crib or wherever he or she was sleeping, and stood over and made some gestures and said some words, and then turned to the parents and said, "Your child is well." And the parents were somewhat skeptical. As you might imagine, if you have a child or a pet or someone who is unwell and someone comes and waves their hands and says some words and says, "It's all well." And so they are perhaps under some duress, upset, and they challenge this healer, this Sufi healer, a bit and say, how can you say that just by saying some words that our child is going to be healed? And the Sufi master turns to them and says, "What do you know? You know nothing. You have no idea what you're talking about," and kind of begins to berate them. And immediately, of course, the two upset parents begin to shake and get angry and turn red and so on. And of course, without missing a beat, the healer says, "You see how these words that can cause you to get upset and turn red and shake, please come in. If you can see in your own experience that that's true, why do you doubt that other words could not have a healing impact?" And so for today, I'm going to speak a little bit about the do not side of words, but mostly want to emphasize really the power, potential, and as we heard in the room today, really the beauty that words can bring into our life. So, traditionally, speech and language, using our words in the Buddhist tradition, is understood as what's known as verbal karma. And the word karma, while it has a lot of misunderstanding, I think, in our culture, basically the word karma just means action. And it's understood that actions have consequences. So that's what's meant by karma. If you think of like a rock dropped in water and there's a ripple impact. The same is true with karma. And there's traditionally understood to be three kinds of karma. Karma of mind. So if you think something, it has a consequence. But if I think, that guy is a jerk, it has less of a consequence than if I go and say to him, you are a jerk, right? So there's less consequence, at least externally. And so there's karma of thought, there's karma of speech, and then there's karma of action. So you can imagine if I not only think this guy is a jerk, but I say it and then I go and punch him in the nose, more consequences ensue. So the initiation is, for most of us, is in the mind with a thought, but the karma, the consequences of our actions come from the mind through language and ultimately through action. So we're focusing here on the karma, the consequences of speech. So as I said before, there's a basic list. It's a little bit of the Ten Commandments kind of list of the speech do-nots. And the basic speech do-nots are, do not lie, so don't say something that isn't true. Do not slander, meaning don't speak ill of other people. Do not lie, do not slander, do not use harsh speech. This is an interesting one, I think. So I always imagine it's, one's mother saying, don't use bad words. Don't use words that are unpleasant, that cause discomfort. Of course, that may be different in different places, in different cultures, but that's one of them. So don't lie, don't slander, don't use harsh speech, and don't use idle speech. This one I think is very interesting. So I sort of imagine, you may know people who just kind of talk. You may be someone who sometimes just kind of talks just to talk, just to fill the space. This is an example of idle speech. Also, in many ways, some of the kinds of things that we engage in our lives, I think of as a form of idle speech, like perhaps television, for example, can be a form of, it's not actually a live person in your room, but it kind of feels that way. And it's just filling the space. That's an example of idle speech. And if you look at any one of these, it pretty quickly becomes clear that they're not, you can't follow them perfectly because it's not so clear. For example, if someone asks you how you are and you tell them a little bit but not everything, is that a lie? So there's a lot of gray area within these do-nots. And for myself, when I work with these kinds of instructions, I actually find it's much more helpful to use them as a kind of question, as a way to begin to reflect on, well, let's see, did I say the truth in the last hour or day or week? Or how often did I kind of couch what I was saying or only say part or blatantly lie? It can become a way to reflect on our lives. And there's a beautiful piece that I want to share with you from, it's a dialogue between the Buddha and his son, Rahula. In the story of the Buddha at some point, pretty much all of his family members, after he left his family, came back and joined his Sangha and became participants in various ways. His wife, his son, his parents, they all joined up later on. But it's a beautiful conversation between the Buddha and his son, and the thing that I really like about it is that he's not shaking his finger at his son and giving him rules about don't lie and don't use bad words and don't do this and don't do that. What he's doing instead is much more what I was just pointing to a moment ago, which is he's giving him a how. He's giving him a process by which to stop, pause, and consider before he speaks. So I'll read this to you. It's from a larger piece in the Buddhist scriptures that's called Advice to Rahula, and this piece is specifically called Reflections on Spoken Karma. That's what I was referring to earlier. So the Buddha says to his son, Rahula, when you desire to do any verbal karma or action, first reflect upon that karma. This verbal action that I desire to do, does it lead to harm for myself? Does it lead to harm for others? Or lead to harm for both sides? Is it an unwholesome verbal action with suffering as its return and suffering as its result? Rahula, if you reflect, and then feel that it is so, then you should not do such verbal action. This, when I read this, I thought, what wonderful advice. He's not saying, don't ever say bad words. He's saying stop, pause, and he's really asking his son, and we could say he's asking all of us in the same way, to take the responsibility ourselves for not grabbing onto a rule to follow, but instead to using speech as a doorway, as something that we do all the time, to use it as a way to stop and consider. Is what I'm saying going to cause harm to me, to someone else, to both of us, or not? There is a sort of wonderful, simplified version of this that's pulled out of later texts that talk about speech, which I find a very, very useful kind of poetic version of this reflection, which is, and I'll offer it to you as a practice that you can engage as you see fit, which is before you speak, to pause and consider about the content of your words. Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? So again, it's not a say this and don't say that, but it's asking each of you to engage in some reflection. And for me, I always imagine a bit, as perhaps the Buddha did with his son, what the world would be like if everyone did that. Imagine if everyone paused for a moment before they spoke. Imagine if the people who were creating the TV shows and advertisements paused for a moment and considered, is this true? Is this necessary? Is this kind? What a different world we would have. Not by saying everybody nobody should ever lie. Not that way. But by asking each of us to take responsibility ourselves for considering before we speak. It's really a beautiful teaching, and I think of this in many ways as this is an example of really good parenting. Parenting that maybe some of us wish we had had more of. Parenting like that. Not being told you have to eat your potatoes or you can't have any dessert, but why don't you consider what would it be like if, and asking us, treating us as if we had the capacity, which each of us does, to consider before we speak or before we act. But there's more here, which is, again, this is, all of what I've said so far is still on the side of talking about speech from the perspective of do not. Basically, do not means do no harm. That's the basic overarching or underlying premise in all of these kinds of instructions, is whatever it is that we're thinking, saying, or doing, whatever kind of karma is being created, we're looking to check, does it do harm? But there's another side, which is, does it create benefit? The sort of positive side of it. So this piece from the Buddha to his son goes on, and he says, Rahula, if you reflect and feel that this verbal action which I desire to do does not lead to harm for myself, does not lead to harm for others, and does not lead to harm for both sides, it is a wholesome verbal action and has joy as its return and joy as its result. Then, Rahula, you ought to do such verbal karma. So he's not just saying, shut up, stop. He also is saying, please come forward and speak when it's wholesome, when it can bring joy. So I want to say a little bit more about that side of it. It is the truth, of course, that the Buddha himself spoke. And that if you read the texts, the early texts that are often describe situations where the Buddha comes and speaks to an audience. In this case, often they'll say the Buddha was speaking to an audience of, 500 bhikkhus and 500 bhikkhunis and these huge audiences that he speaks to, and he'll give a little discourse, and at the end of the text it'll say something like, and at the end of the Buddha speaking, half of the people in the audience had awoken. They'd all been enlightened, and I always think, wow. It's a little daunting, for me as a relatively new teacher, right? You're supposed to speak to the audience, and by the end of your discourse, half the people in the audience should wake up. Okay, well, but it is sort of the far end of what's possible through speech, which is that we can speak in a way that brings joy. We can actually speak in a way that helps people awaken. And really, for me, what I mean by awaken in this way means awaken to the truth of what's here right now, or come home to yourself in this moment, rather than whatever else it is we're doing most of the time, which is usually looking out and trying to get and trying to find and all of that. So in the Zen tradition that I sort of grew up in, there are these series of different texts that describe interactions primarily between teachers and students. And these are known as koans. The word koan actually means a public case. And it's basically a public dialogue that somebody observed, and it was usually in these interactions, again, somebody wakes up. Somebody has a deep insight into themselves or into the nature of the world. And it happens in conversation, in dialogue, through words. And so these koans are cases where somebody observed it and thought it was really cool and wrote it down. And so these cases have been saved over the years. So again, this is this example of how it is that the language has this power and potential. So as I was sort of putting this talk together and reflecting on this and feeling inspired by the possibility of language, I also was finding myself feeling like, wow, big burden, and geez, what's really possible here? And anyway, I came across this wonderful story actually set of stories about the Buddha himself that helped me, and I hope will help you feel not just the daunting part of the possibility of language, but a little bit of the human side of this. And the first piece that I found encouraging about knowing that the Buddha, in particular, became such a powerful speaker, and he did really in the text. You see, his capacity to speak to an incredibly wide and diverse range of different people and help them wake up was profound. He spoke to, sort of his own tribe, as it were, so the monks who came and hung out with him in the forest. But he also spoke to kings, he spoke to warriors, he spoke to politicians, he spoke to housewives and prostitutes, he spoke to farmers. It was a huge range, and he was able to speak in such a way that met the person right where they were and helped them from that place. But it wasn't always that way. This is for me the encouraging part. And it's interesting that when the Buddha first had his own waking up, sort of seeing into the true nature of things experience in a very deep and powerful way, his initial inclination was not to speak. And basically he thought, nobody will understand. I've just had this vision of reality. I understand how things work. And if I try to explain it, nobody's going to understand. And fortunately for all of us, one of the gods hanging out in the sort of heaven realms who had omniscience and was able to see into the mind of beings living on the earth, saw that the Buddha had awoken and was having these thoughts and kind of zipped down from the heavens and appeared before the Buddha and basically begged him and said, please, this is really important, the insight, the awakening, what you've seen and what you've come to understand. And again, with this beautiful language, he said, there are beings with little dust in their eyes who are sort of right on the edge, ready to awaken. And with that encouragement, the Buddha decided, okay, I'm not just going to sit here and be quiet myself and enjoy my own awakening. I'll actually go out and speak. So here's one of my favorite stories from the sort of Buddhist lexicon. And it's a small piece that's easy to miss. But the Buddha gets up from his seat and he goes out, and the first person he runs into is this the wanderer Upaka. And the wanderer Upaka, I'll read to you the beautiful language. The wanderer Upaka sees the Buddha on the road, and I'll read this for you. The Buddha's first teaching after his enlightenment was given to a wanderer he met on the road. The Buddha was unusually tall, incredibly handsome, and had the bearing of the warrior noble prince he had been. He was radiant, shining with his recent experience of illumination. Clearly he was an extremely striking figure, and as he was walking, this wanderer named Upeka stopped him and said, "Excuse me, you are so radiant and bright. Your face is so clear. Surely you must have had some wondrous realization. What kind of practice do you do? Where have you gotten this? Who are you? Who is your teacher?" So you can imagine someone sees this radiant being, and for those of you who've done any kind of extended retreat, you may have a flavor for what this is like. You come out of a day, a week, a month of sitting silently, and there is a kind of radiance that comes off of you, or you may have seen other people with that. And so here in this encounter, this is the Buddha after all, it's a big, big awakening. This guy says, "Wow, basically, that looks really good and I'd like some, so where did you get it?" That's what he says. And here's what the Buddha says. The Buddha responds, "I have no teacher. I am fully self-enlightened. In fact, I am the only enlightened being in the entire world. There is no one I can look to as my teacher or my elder. I alone am fully awakened." You can imagine, right? If you had come up to someone who had a little glow on and said, "Wow," and they said, me, right? Sort of like, wow, a little shocking. So it says, Upaka says, "Good for you, friend," and shaking his head, he scurries off down the side path. So he wasn't, how would I say it? The Buddha's first try at sharing his enlightenment experience after he woke up, it didn't go so well. I find this extremely encouraging. Right? It's true. Because one of the things that's really encouraging about it is that he didn't give up. Right? He didn't say, "Oh, I didn't want to talk, I got convinced to talk, I tried it, and look, it didn't work." This guy ran off. He wasn't impressed. He didn't do that. What he did, actually, what happens is that he begins then speaking about the Four Noble Truths. And instead of talking about enlightenment from the perspective of look at what's happened for me, he says there's suffering in life. In other words, he learns very quickly that it's better to meet people where they are rather than puff up. And even though, of course, everything he says there is true, right? He's not lying, but not so skillful, not so useful. So again, I find this encouraging because not only did the Buddha not give up, he became incredibly skillful over time, as I was saying. So I find this encouraging. And one of the things that, one of the pieces that repeats again and again in the Buddhist scriptures, the sutras or suttas are supposed to be the actual words of the Buddha. Whether or not that's true, we don't know, because the first hundreds of years after the Buddha spoke, it was an oral tradition. Nothing was written down. But at some point, when things began to be written down, there are these encounters, including this encounter with Upaka. Those were stories that were remembered, actually, by the Buddha's wonderful attendant, Ananda, who had this incredible memory, and was able, after the Buddha passed away, was able to remember everything that the Buddha ever did, or every talk that he had ever given, and they wrote it all down. So one of the things that it says in these texts, again and again, and it's, for me, just like the spring poetry this morning, it's incredibly beautiful language that describes what it is that happens after the Buddha speaks and people awaken. Because it's a bit of a mystery. I don't know about to you, but to me, I think I read these stories, whether it's a Zen koan or these encounters with the Buddha and his disciples and so on, and then it says, and all these people awoke, and I think, well, what happened? What is that? What happened there? So here's what it says. I found this, again, a little bit surprising, but also quite moving. So after people wake up, what it says they awaken to is the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dharma arose in him or her, in the person who's awoken. And really, vision of the Dharma means the spotless, immaculate, the pure and clean vision of the truth, vision of how things really are, arose in this person. And this is what it was. All that is subject to arising is subject to passing away. That's it. That's the spotless, immaculate vision of the truth that is considered awakening. That's considered enlightenment. And it seems kind of too simple or something, doesn't it? You notice that there's impermanence. But they're not describing that the person, saw lots of lights and had, visions of past and future lifetimes and was levitating off the ground. No. It's this simple truth of impermanence. The spotless, immaculate vision of the Dharma arose. All that is subject to arising is subject to passing away. This, I think, is vital in some way for us to understand that this idea of awakening is not some wildly strange and esoteric thing. What it is seeing clearly and deeply into the truth of what's here right now. That's it. Now, most of us understand that life is impermanent, that everything that arises passes away. We get that at some level. And often it's described in Buddhist teaching that there's essentially 3 levels of insight. And when it says that a person woke up, doesn't mean that they understood impermanence intellectually. We all know that, right? So the first level of insight is just that. It's the level of you hear about something and you say, oh, insight, I see. I hadn't thought about that before, but look at that, it's true. Everything that arises passes away. So we notice it initially. The second level of insight is when we take that new thing that we are now paying attention to, and we begin to reflect on it in a very personal way. And we see how it's true in our own lives. We see how, for example, maybe we're not as young as we used to be once. So maybe it's, we're a little creakier when we sit down on the cushion. Or we see how it is that we've lost people we love in our lives. Or we've lost things. Or that things keep moving, that nothing stands still. We begin to actually see and feel that, the truth of that in our lives, not just as an idea, but as a personal experience. That's the second level of insight. The third level of insight is what sometimes is described as, and I think of as embodied insight. And this is the insight of impermanence that's not just an idea, oh yeah, I understand, and it's doesn't even stop at, and yes, I see how this is true for me in my personal experience. It's the experience of insight about impermanence that comes primarily through meditative practice, where we actually can see it in a moment. We know for ourselves the truth that this breath that is arising is gone. That each moment flashes into being and is gone. And when we understand that in a deep way, it changes who we are and how we engage with the world. That is the power of seeing the truth. when we see the truth very, very deeply, it transforms us. That's the premise, really. That's kind of that's what Buddhist practice and teaching is holding out for each of us. And it doesn't matter if somebody else saw the truth. Each of us has to find this out in the immediacy and the intimacy of our own experience for ourselves. And when we do, it will radically change things for us and how we engage in the world. So I think often how in our culture we're not so given to look at the truth of impermanence. It's a little bit of a kind of gross understatement, isn't it? In fact, we reject, we deny, we ignore, we get rigid around, right? We don't want to take a look at or face the truth of our own impermanence, our own mortality, our own any of that. There's a story about Indra, who was the king of the gods, and you remember in the Buddhist kind of cosmology, gods are able to see down into all of what's happening on the planet and inside the minds and bodies of human beings. So someone came to Indra and said, with your omniscient vision and capacity to, see into the hearts and minds of human beings, what is it that you find is the most amazing thing about human beings on earth? And I think about this question. You are this omniscient God, and somebody asks you, what's the most amazing thing about human beings? He could have said anything. And what he said was, the most amazing thing about human beings is that every person on earth, everyone without exception, is going to die. And yet, everyone acts as if it's not going to happen to them. That was his answer. That's the most amazing thing about human beings. And so it points to the fact that this truth of impermanence, we have a pretty strong resistance force field of not actually letting it all the way in. We may let it in a little bit, but then the denial, the no, not really, comes right back. So I'm pointing to this as sort of a seed. I'm using language to point to this as a seed for a place that we can look to begin to look and allow the truth, not just the words, but the truth behind the words, to sink in a bit. Because one option is, in the truth of our impermanence, it's a bittersweet truth. And there's a lot of emphasis on the bitter side of it. As human beings, for the most part, we don't like loss. We don't like letting go. We like having and getting and holding, and that's fine. But the sweet part of the truth of impermanence is that it points to beauty and connection. It points to beauty because the fact that everything is impermanent is what makes it so exquisite, right? Those buds on the branches, they're not going to last, right? The warmth that you're feeling of springtime, it's not going to last. The season is going to change. So, when we allow ourselves to actually let in that truth, we actually allow ourselves to see the beauty of what's here. And we can begin to understand that this impermanence is something that's shared. It's true for all of us. So it enhances a sense of our connection to one another. So I'll close with a story and a reading from Katagiri Roshi, who was a Japanese Zen teacher who came over to the U.S. I think he came in the late 60s to support Suzuki Roshi, who was the founder of San Francisco Zen Center. And Katagiri ended up founding a Zen center in the Midwest in Minnesota. And he was sort of renowned for really emphasizing a lot this teaching of impermanence. And there's a story about in the early days of his Zen center, he had this sort of ragtag group of Zen students who decided that they wanted to put on a fundraiser to try to buy some new zafus and things like that. And so they transformed the meditation hall into they rented tables and tea sets and tablecloths, and they invited in this sort of well-heeled crowd to come and talk to them about their practice in hopes that they would get some donations. And so they're putting on this event, and it's all going very well. And at the end, they invite Roshi down to say a few words to the audience. And apparently, without missing a beat, because this was the theme that he had been talking about for weeks, Katagiri stood up in front of the crowd and looked around the room and said, "All of you are going to die." And apparently that was sort of the end of the tea party, right? And they didn't get a lot of donations, and people kind of scurried out the door, no longer impressed with Zen or Zen practice. So I think in some ways that, like the Buddha's initial attempt, when Upaka asked him, who are you and what's up, and he said, I. Katagiri here said, you. And it was not so skillful. It was true, but it wasn't so skillful. So, like the Buddha, I want to read from you a piece from Katagiri's book, Returning to Silence, that offers a perhaps more skillful version of this truth, and really points us to how impermanence is connected to beauty. So he writes, "Sometimes at a restaurant or at the bank, you can see beautiful flowers, and often they are not real flowers, they are plastic. People like plastic flowers very much because they don't die. Plastic flowers are cheap and economical, and if we buy only one bunch, that is enough for our whole life." But even though we try to make plastic flowers exactly the same as living flowers, we never see the real beauty that we see in a living flower. A living flower is fading away, and that is why it is beautiful. The same applies to our life. We are going to the grave. It's a little better than you are going to die. We are going to the grave. We are fading away. That is why we can really live. We should understand how to live within the limitations of human life, based on the very dangerous situation of our fading away. We don't know when we will die, so we have to do our best to live wholeheartedly. This is called purity. It is very beautiful. And this purity and this beauty is what connects us. So I want to offer you a second reflection, in addition to, is it true, is it necessary, is it kind, before speaking, which I think can equally have the potential to transform our world. And so that is to remember that what's true for you, that you are a fading flower, as it were, is true for everyone. And to take a moment just now to look around the room with this knowing that each person is impermanent, and recognizing that each of us is fading away. When we feel this truth, it changes how we engage with ourselves, with other people, and with the world. And this is how it is that seeing the truth allows us to engage from a place of deep compassion, of deep connectedness. So I'll leave you with those couple of practices that you can play with as you go forward into the spring, which will be here for such a short time. It's true. And give you a few minutes for questions or comments if you have them. 1, 2, 3.
I have a question about right speech in a couple of situations that always come up. One is kind of an impersonal social situation where you're talking and you're making how are you fine, and then you're making this small talk, which seems to be what you're saying, kind of like this idle ill in the, but it seems kind of necessary for society. And the other time where it comes up for me is in relationships, and you're having problems and you're trying to tell your truth.
Yes.
And one, you're trying to figure out what the truth is, and then to say it. And then you know that sometimes when you say it, it may cause some suffering in the other person or suffering to yourself. And then so you're figuring out how to do it in a truthful way that's kind and doesn't do harm, but it's difficult. So just your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the key to what you're saying is that struggling with it is a good thing. If you knew that if you were sure that telling that person exactly what I think and blah, blah, blah is the right thing to do, that's where you get into trouble. If you're not quite sure, you're likely to be a lot more tender in doing it. And there is two things I want to say. One is there's a fourth category that comes up besides is it true, is it necessary, is it kind, which is it the right timing? And that's an important one. It's a little subtler in a way. So it may be true, and it may be necessary, and it may be kind, but is this the moment to say? That may not help you with your dilemma. May add more to it. But the other piece that's really central here, and this is true when we're talking about any kind of karma, body, speech, or mind, is that what is essential is the intention behind it. You may be unskillful, as the Buddha was, as Katagiri Roshi was. You can make mistakes, it's okay. But the pausing to reflect and consider is a way to pay attention to your intention. And that's really the best we can do. And hopefully all of us, as we go through life and engage in social situations, in intimate situations, we will all become more and more skillful. But you're not being asked to be perfect right out the gate. Just to do your best. And these are some pieces to consider and reflect that may help you do your best. So, thank you. Thank you. Here, 1, 2, 3.
Well, first, thank you for a beautiful talk. Just really appreciated it. We had a speaker a few weeks ago who spoke about nonviolent communication and right speech, so I've been thinking a lot about this. And I was at a convention, a professional convention, for a week. And whenever I leave San Francisco, I notice that the food isn't as good as it is here. This was in the center of the country. And we got together as a group to go out, and the people put together 2 nights in a row, 2 meals at 2 different restaurants. One was bad, the other was worse. Just not good food. The first was expensive, the second was cheap. And I could feel myself starting to complain. And because I've been thinking about right speech, I was really struggling with what do I say, to whom do I say it, should I say anything? So, and I think I was working with it. I don't know how well I did, but the first meal, I knew the people who had set up the dinner were very proud of it, so I didn't want them to hear. But it was $40 and the food wasn't very good. And I just kept waiting and waiting. It took forever to get the food. I was hungry. I was grumpy.
Yes.
And I just spoke to my table mates and I said, I'm sorry, but is it just me or is this an awful lot of money for not very good food? And people agreed. And I don't think it was vicious, but I think, was it necessary? It was true. I felt like I needed it. I don't know. Was it kind? So I was struggling a little bit. The next night, same sort of situation. It was $12. Food was terrible, worse than the first night. But it was a lot cheaper. It was $12, not $40. And I thought, I'm full. Do I need to do this? How do I feel about this? And so I didn't say anything. And I really don't have an entire answer. I mean...
That's good.
Okay.
No, really, it's good. It's just what I was saying before. The fact that you're struggling with this is the whole point. The point isn't to get it perfect. The point is to cause you to have something to wrestle with that will help keep you awake. Right? If you just sat down and started blurting, this is crappy food, and blah, 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 it's unconscious. you're not being thoughtful about it. This was Buddha's advice to Rahula was not, never do this and always do that. It was be thoughtful. That's the important piece. And the simple way to talk about skillful and unskillful in speech, I think, is speech that is skillful is speech that connects us. Speech that is unskillful is speech that divides us. And what I heard in the first part of your story was that it was mixed because there was some of both. You were speaking in a way that, in fact, connected the people at your table, but it may have been kind of divisive to the other people there. That's a hard call, right? But that's a guideline to consider as you're just trying to decide, do I say it or do I not say it? Does it connect us or does it divide us? And sometimes saying very difficult things actually increases the intimacy in the situation. That's wonderful. Doesn't mean it has to be easy and nice to be connected. It actually more important that it's real and that you have an intention to connect, not divide. That's a piece of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. David.
I was at a memorial yesterday for somebody who was part of the Sangha that died a while back. And I had gone to one or two memorials for him before, and the thought occurred to me, do I really need to go to a third memorial? And I had no answer. But, so I went. And when I walked into it, I saw somebody who was sitting 4 or 5 rows ahead of me, and that seemed a very long time. Years. And because of the nature of what it is like for me, and I think for any of us, to be in the presence of death, which is really a powerful experience of how impermanent we are.
Absolutely.
I smiled at his back, and evidently his back felt that. He turned around and he looked at me, saw me smiling, got up, came all the way around, and gave me this incredible hug. We just hugged. And then he went back to his seat. No word, no nothing, no thought, no speech, just direct action. And the realization of all that just came much later, which was in the presence of not having access to the person whom we had all come to honor, remember, tell stories about. We each began to substitute each other for that, so that we could hold that together in the moment. And that's all that we had. Because the next moment, we would trade places. And I'll be out there, or whoever, and other people will get together and hug.
Yeah, and that's why being in that, whether it's at a memorial or at the bedside of someone dying, or it allows us to be so much more real in a way, and particularly real. It doesn't have to go this way. Some people it goes the other way and they just close. But it has the potential to really open us in a way that's real, actually.
And what I would ask, and I'm glad you said that, Pam, what I would ask is, even the closing is such a teaching, because it's such an opening up to the closing, such an opportunity for the opening up to the closing, and then the reflection on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. It's part of the truth about having a heart, is that the heart opens and the heart closes. And I was at a Zen ceremony once where everyone gets to stand up and ask a question of the teacher. And it was to the end of a long period of intensive practice where we'd all been living together. And someone stood up to say, I'm going home now, and I feel like my heart has opened so much. How do I keep my heart open as I go back into my life in the world? And the teacher held up his hand and said, "Is this a heart?" The student said, "No." He said, "Is this a heart?" And he said, "No." He said, "Right, this is a heart." That's what keeps us alive. If our heart were just open, we'd be in cardiac arrest. Right? But in fact, that's the truth for us as human beings. And as you said so beautifully, welcoming that, the whole of it, is our humanness, welcoming our humanness. So, yeah. One more.
I'm conscious of the time. That could be the last word.
Okay. Okay. Last one.
As a teacher, have you ever felt a power come through you that was not of your making?
I'm curious why you ask. What's
because I have seen it happen.
Uh-huh.
I think I've felt it happen. I remember once the story of Florence Olivier after a performance of Othello. The stage manager was frightened, and he said, "You were scary." He says, "I don't know what was going on," and the whole audience was just terrified.
Yeah.
It was demonic.
Yeah.
And the capacity somehow to just be a channel for something bigger. Is that part of the Buddhist lexicon? I mean, it seems like it is.
I don't know if it's part of the Buddhist lexicon. I do think it's part of the human lexicon. As you say, that many people in the room have probably had some experience of that in themselves or seen it in others. Certainly. Yeah. We are, if we allow ourselves to be, and that's why the power of, seeing the truth of impermanence that allows us to open and connect to others, we are part of the fabric we are made of something much larger than just this. And when we allow ourselves to open to that, all kinds of things are possible. Yeah. So let's close with a dedication.
We're going to have to start announcements first, and then
I'm sorry. I see.
Are there any announcements?
I'm Todd. I'm the host today.
Hi, Todd.
There's snacks, lemon seed bread, and apples with lemon juice on them. And let's see. Oh, if you're going to have tea, please wash out your cup and put it on the rack to dry afterwards. There's going to be a dana bowl passed around. Suggested donation is $5 to $8 or more if you can, less if you can. And after the social hour, people will gather toward the front of the building to go out for lunch later. And I think that's it. Oh, there's a sign-up sheet. If you'd like to receive more information about the GBF, either online or mailed to you, you can sign up for that. And we're also publishing a GBF directory, which will be updated every few months. And if you'd like to be on the directory, or if you'd like to not be on the directory, please indicate that on the sign-up sheet. That's it.
I'd like to say about the directory, I have a updated copy that I'd like people to look at and make corrections on if it's not accurate. If it is accurate, please put a check mark next to your name so that I'll know that it's okay. If you're not on this directory, please sign up on the pink sheet that Todd mentioned out by the Dana Bowl, and it will get on here. But don't add to this, just correct.
Speaking of impermanence, about the 3,300th Iraqi person is going to die. The American soldier in Iraq is going to die next week, plus one of several 100,000 Iraqis. And I'm pointing this out because there is next Sunday there is a peace demonstration downtown, starting at Gersten Herman Plaza and walking down Market Street. The Buddhist Peace Fellowship will be gathering at the Zen Center on Page and Lagoon at about 10:30 to walk down. And hopefully, you wouldn't be here if you were there, but I'm going to be there. I would remind you about that. It's the 4th anniversary of the war next week.
Any other announcements? Oh, okay. Okay.
Potlucks. Anybody wants to hold a potluck? See it.
Jim?
Yeah, next Sunday we're having sort of part 2 of the All Songs of Reason, where we're going to discuss among ourselves directions, topics, programs, anything you have to offer and thoughts about our community and what we do here. So sorry it's in conflict.
Okay.
I just want to remind folks in the East Bay that there is an East Bay Center on Broadway near Grand, and I know that on Thursday evenings there is a People of Color sit there at the Buddhist Center in there are a number of activities throughout the week. There's a gay and lesbian LGBTQ group that meets, I believe it is on the last Wednesday of the month. So just so folks will be aware of that.
That's not the Pacific Center.
No, it's not the Pacific Center. It's actually in the building downstairs where Creation Spirituality was, in that building, which is no longer there.
Any other announcements? Okay, I'd like to welcome our newcomer. Could you tell us your name again?
Keith Hubbard.
Please welcome Keith out in the social hour after the meditation and talk it over. And we will close. Do you want a copy of the...
I have it. By the power and truth of our practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all know the sacred happiness that is sorrowless and live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, knowing the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.